The courthouse felt cold that April morning, all marble floors and echoing footsteps that made everything seem more final. I sat at the defendant's table wearing a navy dress my father had bought me years ago for my college graduation, something that made me feel armored and strong. Across the aisle, Ryan sat with his lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Derek Patterson who looked like he charged $1,000 just to shake your hand. Ryan kept glancing at me with that smug smile I'd once found charming but now recognized as the grin of a predator who thought he'd already won. Hello reader. Welcome to the Mech Story Porch channel. I'm so glad you're here with me today because I need to share something that changed my entire life. If this story resonates with you, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel and share this with someone who might need to hear it. Your comments mean the world to me, so don't forget to tell me where you're listening from and also leave your thoughts below. Now let me tell you about the day justice finally found the man who tried to destroy me. Judge Rachel Morrison entered, a stern woman who looked like she'd seen every trick in the book and was tired of all of them. Ryan's lawyer stood immediately, his voice smooth and confident. Your Honor, this is a straightforward case. My client, Mr. Ryan Mitchell, entered into marriage with the defendant in good faith. Unfortunately, Ms. Harrison became financially irresponsible after inheriting a substantial sum from her late father. Mr. Mitchell actually protected many of the marital assets from her poor decisions. He's simply asking for his fair share of what they built together. I watched Ryan nodding along, his face arranged in an expression of pained nobility, like a man being forced to do something distasteful but necessary. He thought this was over. He thought he'd walked away with everything, my inheritance, my home, my dignity. What he didn't know was that the man he'd spent 2 years mocking, the father whose memory he'd disrespected at every turn, had orchestrated the most perfect revenge from beyond the grave. Except my father wasn't in his grave at all. But Ryan didn't know that yet. As I sat there listening to his lawyer paint me as some helpless, emotional woman who couldn't manage her own life, my mind drifted back to the beginning. Back to when I actually believed Ryan Mitchell loved me. Back to when I was so blinded by grief and loneliness that I couldn't see the trap closing around me. And I thought about how every moment of the past 2 years had been leading to this courtroom, to this day, to the revenge that was about to unfold. You see, sometimes the best way to catch a predator is to let him think he's already won. It all started 3 years ago, 6 months after my father died. Or at least 6 months after I thought he died. I met Ryan at a charity gala in downtown Seattle. One of those black tie events where Seattle's elite gathered to write checks and feel good about themselves. I hadn't wanted to go. 6 months after losing Dad to what I thought was a sudden heart attack, I was barely functioning. I taught second grade during the day, moving through the motions, and spent my evenings alone in the house Dad had left me, surrounded by his things, drowning in memories. But my friend Jessica had insisted, practically dragging me out of my sweatpants and into a dress I'd forgotten I owned. Ryan appeared beside me at the bar like something out of a movie. Tall, handsome in that polished way that comes from expensive gyms and better genetics, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. You look like you'd rather be anywhere else, he said, and his smile was warm, genuinely warm. Me too. These things are torture, aren't they? We talked for 3 hours that night. He told me he worked in investment banking, that he'd grown up in Portland, that he'd lost his mother to cancer 5 years ago and understood grief. When I mentioned my father, his eyes filled with what looked like real empathy. I'm so sorry, he said, touching my hand gently. Losing a parent changes everything, doesn't it? He asked me out the next day and then the day after that. Within weeks, Ryan had become the center of my world. He took me to expensive restaurants where waiters knew his name. He sent flowers to my classroom with notes that made my teaching colleagues sigh with envy. He listened to me talk about Dad for hours, never seeming bored or impatient. He sounds like an incredible man, Ryan would say. I wish I could have met him. On our 3-month anniversary, he took me to the San Juan Islands for the weekend. We stayed in a bed and breakfast overlooking the water, and as we watched the sunset, he told me he was falling in love with me. I believed him completely. We were married 10 months after we met, a small ceremony at the same venue where we'd first encountered each other. It felt like fate, like Dad had somehow sent Ryan to take care of me. Ryan moved into Dad's house, my house now, and for the first few months, everything seemed perfect. He was attentive, loving, always knowing exactly what to say to make me feel cherished. He took an interest in the estate Dad had left me, the $2 million in various accounts, the house that was now worth close to $1 million in Seattle's crazy market. "Let me help you manage this," Ryan offered one evening. "I work with money every day. You shouldn't have to worry about this stuff." I gave him everything. Complete access to my accounts, my trust, my heart. Looking back now, I can see how carefully he played it, how every move was calculated. But at the time, I just felt grateful that someone loved me, that I wasn't alone anymore. My father had been my whole world, and when he died, the emptiness was unbearable. Ryan filled that emptiness, and I was too desperate to see that he was only filling it to drain everything else away. The mask he wore was perfect, seamless. It didn't start to slip until about 6 months into our marriage, and even then the changes were so gradual I barely noticed them at first. The first sign came when Ryan suggested I quit teaching. We were having dinner and I was telling him about one of my students, a little boy named Marcus who'd finally learned to read after struggling all year. I was excited, animated, proud. Ryan set down his fork and looked at me with something that wasn't quite a smile. "Emma, why are you still doing this?" he asked. "You inherited $2 million. You don't need to exhaust yourself with other people's kids. We don't need the money." I laughed, thinking he was joking. "I love teaching, Ryan. It's not about the money." His expression hardened for just a second, so quickly I almost thought I'd imagined it. "Right?" he said, picking up his fork again. "I just think you could do better with your time. But it's your choice, obviously." The conversation moved on, but something about it bothered me, a tiny seed of discomfort that I pushed down and ignored. You see, when you want something to be true badly enough, you'll dismiss the evidence right in front of your face. Then came the comments about my father. They started, subtle little remarks about how Dad had been overprotective or old-fashioned in his thinking. But they escalated. One night, Ryan was reviewing our financial statements, something he'd taken complete control of, and he shook his head in frustration. "Your father really didn't know what he was doing with money, did he? These investment choices are amateur hour. Good thing I'm here to fix his mistakes." I felt anger flash through me, hot and sharp. "My father built everything from nothing," I said, my voice tight. He knew exactly what he was doing. Ryan held up his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, I'm not attacking him. I'm just saying he wasn't a financial expert. Emma. That's why you have me now." He said it with such condescension, like he was explaining something simple to a child. I wanted to argue, to defend Dad's memory, but Ryan had already moved on, tapping on his laptop like the conversation was over. That night, lying in bed next to him, I felt a distance I couldn't name. Something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Or maybe I didn't want to. By our first anniversary, Ryan had taken over everything. He'd consolidated my accounts, moved assets around for better returns, and convinced me to put the house in both our names for legal protection. He'd also systematically isolated me from my friends. Jessica rarely called anymore because every time she invited me out, Ryan had already made plans for us. My colleagues stopped inviting me to happy hour after I'd declined a dozen times because Ryan said he'd made reservations somewhere special. I didn't see it happening. That's the insidious thing about manipulation. It happens so slowly, so carefully, that you wake up one day completely isolated and can't remember how you got there. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in October, almost 18 months into our marriage. I came home early from work with a migraine, something that had been happening more frequently as the tension in our marriage grew. Ryan was in his home office, door slightly ajar, and I heard his voice before I saw him. "No, she has no idea," he was saying into his phone, laughing in a way I'd never heard before. "The prenup her father insisted on doesn't matter. I've been moving assets for months. By the time the divorce goes through, she'll have nothing. The house is already in my company's name, technically." She signed the papers thinking they were insurance documents. I stood frozen in the hallway, my hand pressed against the wall to keep from collapsing. This wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. But Ryan kept talking, each word a knife sliding between my ribs. Her father was an idiot for leaving everything to her. She's too trusting, too naive. I'll walk away with at least $3 million once everything's liquidated. Maybe more if my lawyer is as good as he claims. He paused, listening, and then laughed again. "Love her? Are you serious? I've been playing this role for 2 years. I deserve an Oscar, honestly." The crying widow act got old after month 3. The crying widow act. That's what my grief had been to him. An act. A performance he'd had to endure. I backed away slowly, somehow making it to our bedroom without making a sound, and locked the door. I sat on the edge of the bed, trembling, my whole world reforming itself into something unrecognizable. The man I'd married, the man I'd trusted with everything, had been systematically destroying me from the inside out. He'd weaponized my grief, my loneliness, my trust. And he'd been so confident, so certain I'd never figure it out. But as I sat there, something inside me hardened into steel. I thought about my father, about how he'd always told me to be strong, to never let anyone make me feel small. And I pulled out my phone and called the one lawyer Dad had always trusted, a man named George Mitchell who'd handled his estate. "George," I whispered when he answered. "I need help." And I think my father knew this would happen. There was a long pause on the other end, and then George said something that changed everything. "Emma, your father and I need to talk to you. Can you meet me tomorrow morning? Come alone. There are things about your inheritance that Ryan doesn't know. Things your father made sure to protect." That meeting with George the next morning was when I learned the truth that would destroy Ryan. I sat in George's office, the same office where Dad and I had met after Mom died, where we'd planned her funeral, where Dad had told me I'd always be taken care of. George slid a folder across the desk, and inside were documents, photographs, surveillance reports. "Emma, your father suspected Ryan from the very beginning," George said quietly. "He hired a private investigator the week after you introduced them. The investigation had uncovered everything. Ryan Mitchell wasn't even his real name. It was Ryan Pearson, and he had a history. 2 previous marriages to wealthy women, both ending in divorce. Both women left with almost nothing. One in California, one in Boston. He had a pattern, a system. He found vulnerable women with money, swept them off their feet, gained access to their assets, and then disappeared with as much as he could steal. Your father wanted to tell you," George continued, "but he knew you wouldn't believe him. You were in love. So he did something else." George opened another folder, thicker than the first. "The $2 million Ryan knows about. That's real. The house. Real. But your father's actual estate is worth $23 million. Offshore accounts, property holdings in 3 states, trust funds set up in your mother's maiden name years before you were born. Ryan's lawyers will never find them because they don't know how to look." I stared at the papers, my mind reeling. Dad had protected me, even knowing I wouldn't listen to warnings. He'd built a financial fortress around me that Ryan couldn't breach. "But there's more," George said and pulled out a laptop. "Your father made a video before he before he faked his death. The world stopped. What did you say? George turned the laptop toward me, and there on the screen was my father, sitting in what looked like a tropical location, palm trees visible through a window behind him. He looked older, thinner, but unmistakably alive. George pressed play. "Emma, sweetheart." Dad's voice filled the room and I started crying immediately. "If you're watching this, it means I was right about Ryan. I'm so sorry, baby girl. Sorry I had to put you through this pain. But I needed you to see who he really was. I couldn't just tell you. You would have thought I was being an overprotective father. You would have chosen him over me and he would have isolated you completely. So I did the only thing I could think of. I made him think there was no one left to protect you." Dad explained everything in the video. How he'd faked the heart attack with George's help and a doctor friend who'd signed the death certificate. How he'd been living in Costa Rica, watching from a distance through the investigators he'd hired. How he'd waited for Ryan to show his true colors, knowing that men like him only reveal themselves when they think they've won. "I needed you to be strong enough to face him without me," Dad said, his eyes intense on the screen. "I needed you to see that you have everything inside you to protect yourself. And I need you to know something, Emma. When the time comes when you're standing in that courtroom and he thinks he's destroyed you, I'll be there. I'll walk through those doors and we'll make sure he never hurts anyone again." The video ended and I sat in stunned silence. My father was alive. He'd been alive this whole time, watching me grieve, watching me marry Ryan, watching me be manipulated and controlled. Part of me wanted to be furious at him for the deception, for letting me suffer through that loss. But a larger part was understood with perfect clarity. Without this, I never would have believed the truth about Ryan. I would have defended him, chosen him, and ended up destroyed. "So what do we do now?" I asked George, wiping my eyes. He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd been planning this moment for 2 years. "Now we build a case. And we make sure Ryan walks into a trap he'll never escape." The next 3 months were the hardest of my life. I had to continue living with Ryan, continue pretending I had no idea what was coming. George gave me a small recording device no bigger than a button and I wore it every day. I captured everything. Ryan's phone calls with his lawyer plotting to take my assets, his conversations with his mistress. Yes, there was a mistress, a detail that somehow hurt less than it should have. His smug comments about how easy I was to manipulate. Each recording was another nail in his coffin. Ryan filed for divorce in January, right after the holidays. He made a show of it, telling me over breakfast that he couldn't do this anymore, that we'd grown apart. I played the devastated wife perfectly, crying and begging him to reconsider. Inside, I was counting down the days until he'd face the truth. His lawyer was aggressive, immediately going after every asset. They wanted the house, the inheritance money, even my car. Ryan's confidence was breathtaking. "You should just settle, Emma," he told me one evening, his voice dripping with false concern. "Fighting this will only cost you more money." I'm being generous with my offer. I just nodded and cried, and he smiled like he'd already won the lottery. Which brings me back to that courtroom in April, where I'd been sitting quietly while Ryan's lawyer painted me as an incompetent woman who needed to be saved from herself. My lawyer, Patricia Chin, one of the best litigators on the West Coast, hired by my father 6 months earlier, finally stood up. The energy in the room shifted immediately. "Your Honor," Patricia said, her voice clear and unwavering, "the plaintiff's entire case is built on fraud. We have evidence that Mr. Ryan Pearson, that's his real name by the way, has systematically stolen from my client, manipulated her trust, and engaged in a pattern of predatory behavior spanning 3 states and multiple victims." She presented the recordings first. My voice, Ryan's voice, his conversations plotting to take everything. The judge's expression grew darker with each clip. Then came the bank records showing the transfers Ryan had made to shell companies he'd created. His lawyer tried to object, tried to claim the recordings were inadmissible, but Patricia had covered every legal base. "We also have testimony from 2 previous victims," Patricia continued, "and 2 women I'd never met stood up in the gallery. Mr. Pearson married both of these women under false pretenses, gained access to their finances, and divorced them after emptying their accounts. He's not a husband, Your Honor. He's a professional con artist." Ryan's face had gone from confident to pale, and he was whispering frantically to his lawyer, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. But Patricia wasn't done. "Your Honor, there's one more thing," she said, and I felt my heart start to race. "The plaintiff believes he's divorcing a woman who inherited $2 million. What he doesn't know is that Emma's father, Robert Harrison, established multiple trusts and holdings that were never disclosed to the defendant. The actual estate value is $23 million, none of which Mr. Pearson has any legal claim to." Ryan's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock and fury. He started to stand, but his lawyer pulled him back down. I watched the realization cross his face. He'd spent 2 years working for nothing. All that manipulation, all that effort, and he was going to walk away with less than nothing. "Furthermore," Patricia said, and her voice rose with something that sounded like satisfaction, "Mr. Harrison is prepared to testify about how he discovered the defendant's true nature and the measures he took to protect his daughter." The courtroom doors opened. I heard the footsteps before I saw him. Confident, familiar, the sound of my father's walk that I'd know anywhere. The gasp that went through the courtroom was audible, but nothing compared to the sound Ryan made, a strangled noise that might have been shock or might have been fear. My father walked into that courtroom like he'd never left this world, looking older and grayer but with eyes that were sharp and protective and fixed directly on Ryan. Ryan's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, shock, rage, and then absolute terror. Because he understood at that moment that he hadn't just been caught. He'd been played. Played by a dead man who wasn't dead at all. "Your Honor," my father said as he was sworn in, his voice filling the courtroom with an authority that made everyone sit up straighter, "my name is Robert Harrison, and I faked my death 2 years ago for one reason: to expose the man who was trying to destroy my daughter." Dad explained everything. The investigation he'd commissioned, the evidence he'd gathered, how he'd watched from Costa Rica as Ryan revealed exactly who he was. "I knew telling my daughter wouldn't work," Dad said, looking directly at Ryan, who seemed to be shrinking in his seat. "She was grieving, vulnerable, and this man is a professional. He knew exactly how to exploit her pain. So I had to make him think he'd won. I had to make him comfortable enough to show his true nature. And he did. He showed us exactly who he is: a predator who targets grieving women for their money." The evidence Dad had collected was overwhelming. Financial records showing Ryan's previous cons, testimony from the other women he'd victimized, proof of the shell companies he'd used to steal from me. Judge Morrison listened to everything, her face growing harder with each revelation. When Dad finished testifying, she didn't even recess to deliberate. "Mr. Pearson," she said, her voice ice cold, "not only are you getting nothing in this divorce, but I'm awarding Ms. Harrison damages for fraud and emotional distress. I'm also referring this case to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. You're looking at multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and theft by deception. You should have stopped after the first 2 women, but you got greedy. And now you're going to pay for it." Ryan sat frozen, his perfect plan crumbling into dust around him. His lawyer was already packing up his briefcase, clearly wanting nothing more to do with this case. "The judge granted me everything: the house, full control of all accounts, and awarded me an additional $2 million in damages from Ryan's own assets, which would be seized before he could hide them. As the judge dismissed us, I stood and turned to face Ryan. He was staring at me with something between hatred and disbelief. "You actually thought you could do this to me," I said quietly so only he could hear. "You thought I was weak, that my grief made me stupid. But you forgot something. My father raised me to be strong. You just couldn't see it through your own arrogance." He opened his mouth to respond, but I'd already turned away. I walked to where my father stood and we met in the middle of the courtroom. We didn't say anything at first, just held each other while I cried into his shoulder, not from sadness this time, but from relief and joy and the overwhelming feeling of being protected and loved. "I'm sorry I put you through this," Dad whispered. "But I needed you to be strong enough to save yourself. And you were Emma. You were so strong." I pulled back and looked at him, at this man who'd loved me enough to fake his own death, to watch me suffer from a distance, all to protect me from someone he knew I wouldn't believe was dangerous. "I am strong," I said. "I always was. I just needed to remember." Ryan tried to approach me as we left the courthouse, desperation replacing his earlier confidence, probably trying to find some angle, some last manipulation to salvage something from the wreckage. But security escorted him away, and I watched him go without a shred of sympathy. The man who'd tried to destroy me, who'd mocked my grief and my father's memory, was going to face criminal charges. He'd probably spend years in prison. And he'd never be able to do this to anyone else. I walked out into the April sunshine with my father on one side and George on the other, and for the first time in 3 years I felt truly free. Not just free from Ryan, but free from the grief and loneliness that had made me vulnerable in the first place. My father squeezed my hand. "So," he said with a slight smile, "I suppose I need to officially come back from the dead. That's going to be interesting paperwork." We laughed and it felt good, felt right. We went to lunch at Dad's favorite restaurant, the one I'd avoided since his death, because it hurt too much. Now we sat in a booth by the window and he told me about Costa Rica, about the small house he'd rented on the beach, about the investigators who'd sent him daily reports on Ryan's movements. "I watched you through all of it," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Every day he hurt you, every moment he made you feel small. I wanted to come back and destroy him myself. But I knew this was the only way." "You were right," I told him. "If you'd just told me, I wouldn't have believed you. I would have thought you were being an overprotective dad who didn't like my husband. I had to see it for myself." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The hardest part was watching you grieve me. Watching you at my funeral, seeing you cry. Emma, that almost broke me. I almost gave up the whole plan right then." I reached across the table and took his hand. "But you didn't. Because you knew I needed to learn this lesson. And I did, Dad. I learned it." That evening I met Dad at our favorite spot on Alki Beach. We sat on a bench watching the sunset over the water, the same water he'd supposedly been cremated and scattered in 2 years earlier. "Do you regret it?" I asked him. "The plan, I mean. Would you do it differently if you could go back?" He thought for a long moment, then shook his head. "No. Because look at you now, Emma. You're not the broken, grieving woman Ryan found at that gala. You're strong, confident, independent. You learned that you can survive the worst betrayal and come out stronger. I couldn't have taught you that by just telling you to be careful. You had to learn it yourself." He was right. The woman I was now, the woman who'd stood up to Ryan in that courtroom, who'd gathered evidence and built a case, who'd reclaimed her life and her power, she was someone the old Emma couldn't have imagined becoming. Ryan had tried to destroy me, but instead he'd forged me into something unbreakable. And my father, in his own complicated, painful way, had given me the space to become that person. "Thank you," I told Dad, leaning my head on his shoulder as the sun dipped below the horizon. "For everything. For protecting me, for believing I was strong enough, for coming back." He kissed the top of my head just like he used to when I was little. I never left, sweetheart. I was always right there watching over you. That's what fathers do. And in that moment, sitting on that bench with my father who died and come back to life, I felt something I hadn't felt in 3 years. I felt complete. I have learned that true strength isn't about never being fooled. It's about having the courage to face the truth when it's revealed, the wisdom to protect yourself, and the resilience to rise from betrayal stronger than before. The people who genuinely love you will build you up, never tear you down. Trust your instincts, protect your independence, and remember that you possess everything within you to overcome even the deepest betrayal. What did you learn?